business. My work is about adding value so people build fulfilling lives and businesses. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's business conversation, the legal implications of remote working, where you can expect to glean key insights into this very important topic. But before we dive in, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome today's guest, Anne Babu. If you can just put the clap emoji in the chat, that would be great. Anne is an accomplished advocate of the High Court of Kenya with over 17 years of experience in employment and commercial law. She is the founder of Anne Babu and Company Advocates, a firm that supports both for-profit and not-for-profit organizations in navigating the complexities of labor law. Anne and her team work closely with corporate employers on everything from mutual separations and performance management through to disciplinary procedures, restructuring, and legal representation in court. They also deliver training on critical aspects of employment law, equipping leaders with the knowledge to make sound, compliant decisions. Anne's expertise has earned her global recognition by Chambers and Partners and Legal 500. Beyond her legal practice, she contributes to wider societal impact as a board director at Gold Star Kenya and NABU Global Incorporated. Yeah, that's correct. And we're delighted to have you here with us today to share your valuable insights.
Thanks, Anne. It's my pleasure to be here.
Super. Now, let me just say this to everyone as we begin. I'd like to ask that you please type any questions you may have into the chat. We will be monitoring that, and we will try and have as many answered as is possible. But to get us started, let's start with something many remote workers often wonder. And how can someone tell if they're legally an employee or a contractor? And does that classification really matter?
Yes, it does matter. There are tests that have been developed by our courts and also by the Kenya Revenue Authority. It matters to KRA whether you classify yourself as an employee or as a contractor, contractor also known as consultant. So the primary test is control. If you're an employee, then it means your employer is controlling not just the work that you do, but how you do it. So your employer is going to tell you what work to do. So I'm employing you to do X. I expect you to do it on these days, at this time, in this manner. So there is a high level of control that is exercised on an employee. Whereas when you're talking about a contractor or a consultant, you're talking about somebody who has a lot of autonomy. Most of the time you'll be brought on board because you have an expertise or a skill that is needed. You'll have clear deliverables, and the person who has engaged you will not necessarily dictate to you, where do you work from, how do you work, what days do you work, what time do you work. The person who has engaged you doesn't really care about that. All they care about is, are you meeting the deliverables? Because in most instances, your pay is pegged on those deliverables. So the control test is normally the strongest test. There are other tests. For example, the courts and KRA will look at the nature of the agreement you have, and also just the substance. So for example, if the agreement talks about things like, you're entitled to leave, you're entitled to medical cover, you're entitled to, all these other benefits that, are primarily entitlements of employees, then there's a good chance that it's going to be determined that you're an employee. Because really for a consultant, normally it's, I'm bringing you on board to do X and I'm going to pay you Y. So we don't talk about medical cover, we don't talk about paying certain statutory deductions. We don't talk about leave, all we'll do is you give us an invoice, will withhold tax, will pay you your money. So those are some of the ways that our courts and KRA will determine whether you're a
Yeah.
consultant or whether you're an employee. And so it does matter. It's a very critical thing.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
really helpful. And maybe just to ask Anne, I know that you're specifically talking about the Kenyan law, but are some of these parameters the same across most jurisdictions?
They are, and that's the benefit with most of our, laws, especially when it comes to things like employee, consultant, contractors. You will find we have borrowed heavily from the UK,
Hmm.
and UK means Commonwealth. It means, there's a wide in the number of jurisdictions, you'll find they will apply the same tests. And so
Okay.
globally, if you're going to talk to somebody about being a consultant, they're
Hmm.
expecting that you're somebody who's quite autonomous, somebody who's quite in control of their time. But if you
Hmm.
tell somebody you're an employee, then
Hmm.
they know that somebody is controlling quite a bit of how you work and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, super. No, that's really good. Now, when a remote worker is based in one country, but they're working for a company in another country, which country's laws apply and what impact does this have on the remote workers' rights?
Okay. So for example, you're working in Kenya and your employer is based in the US.
Hmm.
Um, what our Kenya Employment Act, what the government wants to see is
Hmm.
that if you're working within the jurisdiction of Kenya, then
Hmm.
you are entitled to, or you are bound by the Employment Act. Yeah,
Hmm.
so our government does not want a situation where somebody is working here, but they're not getting the statutory minimums,
Hmm.
and that's why the Employment Act basically provides that, it applies to anybody who is employed as an employee by an employer. So it
Hmm.
doesn't restrict that and say by an employer who's based in Kenya. It's like as long as you fall under the definition of employee, meaning you're engaged for a salary, under a contract of service,
Hmm.
then you fall within the ambit of the Employment Act. And so you will be expected to abide by at least those statutory minimums. So
Hmm.
even though, and it's quite common, I've seen some of these employment contracts that originate from foreign jurisdictions, you
Hmm.
will find they will indicate that your contract is subject to, say, US law. Uh,
Hmm.
well, that's well and good. But as far as the Kenyan government is concerned, they still want to ensure that if somebody comes to Kenya, they enjoy the minimums and the protections under our labor laws. Yeah. So it's
So
important.
you're
If
okay.
so if you're the person who's bringing somebody to work here, it's
Hmm.
important that at least you take some time to familiarize yourself with some of these laws.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
So am I hearing you say that? So if, for example, I was working remotely for an organization in the US, um, as long as they subscribe to the basic parameters covered by the Employment Act of where I am, then we're okay.
Yes, correct.
Okay,
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
that's helpful.
So the
That's
government doesn't want a situation where somebody is working within our jurisdiction and they're not enjoying at least the minimums. And that's
hmm.
why the employment law provides the minimums. You can
Hmm.
provide a lot more, but the government wants at least to make sure that those minimums are protected for everybody who's an employee within our jurisdiction.
Okay, no, that's really
Yeah.
good. Okay. Now, this is a question we've gotten for quite a few people
Yeah.
around taxes, because taxes can get confusing when you're working across borders.
Yeah.
What should remote workers be aware of when it comes to tax obligations and compliance?
Okay, tax very important. Anybody who's coming in as a remote worker should take the time to familiarize themselves with the tax obligations.
Hmm.
So for example, like in Kenya,
Hmm.
if you're here working and you get to the point where you've been here for 180 days, then
Hmm.
your employer is deemed to be a tax resident in Kenya, whether or not they have a physical presence. The fact that you're here
Mm-hmm.
you become like the physical presence that KRA will use to determine that you ought to be paying taxes here. So it's one thing for you to just be stepping in the country, you're coming for 2, 3 days for a work trip. But if you're
Mm-hmm.
going to be here for some time and you're going to clock the threshold where you're now deemed a tax resident, then
Mm-hmm.
you know that you have to comply with the tax laws. So that's something that, again, I have found is very cross. It goes out. Other jurisdictions have the same thing. It seems like it's not just Kenya. There are 100, whether it's 183 or 180.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are like, you've spent that much time in the country and you're working, they will be deeming your income to be earned and derived in Kenya, and so, or in that jurisdiction. And so there's an expectation that there should be some taxes being paid. And so it's very important that right from the onset, whoever is
Mm-hmm.
coming in as a remote worker or whoever is sending somebody as a remote worker takes or some time to, get tax advice from
Mm-hmm.
the onset. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
I'm curious, just as you think even just about those questions you've just sort of responded to,
Yeah.
are there some real life examples you can share with us and some stories that will drive the point home? Because I'm sure everyone's listening and thinking, okay, I hear that, but what does that look like in real life?
Okay. I think it's quite common, especially for somebody who, like a dependent. Let's say you're coming in here.
Hmm.
Perhaps your husband is coming to work for one organization, and then, or your wife is coming to work for one organization, and then you come in, and then you come in as a dependent initially.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then what happens is that you secure employment,
Hmm.
likely from a foreign entity. So
Hmm.
you see, sometimes somebody might want to just remain under the radar in the sense that, you have your dependent pass and you're just doing your work, it's very low risk. Who's going to ever find out,
Hmm.
So those are the instances that are quite common. Somebody is already here by virtue of their spouse or
Hmm.
their partner.
Hmm.
They secure employment. They then just go ahead and start working, oblivious to the fact that there could actually be some tax obligations on their end. So I've seen quite a bit of that. And then what happens is that when the tax authorities catch up with you, it's not you're the one who's here, not really
Yeah.
your employer. And so there's an
Yes.
obligation then at that point to begin to tidy up things. And that can be quite onerous, especially when you put together things to do with the penalties and interest that could be accumulated by virtue of the fact that you've not been compliant right from the beginning.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And that would that hold true whether the person's actually an employee or a contractor?
Yeah, it does. The tax brackets are different, obviously, because for an employee, you are taxed based on certain bands. You're
Yes.
earning this is the tax rate. You're earning this, up to
Yeah.
this is the tax rate. So it's different, and you're paying PAYE.
Yes.
Whereas if you're a contractor, then you're going to be paying a withholding, or the person who's paying you is supposed to be withholding tax. So the
Mm.
taxes are different in that sense, but there is
Yeah.
still a tax obligation.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, as we've said before, this will also apply to other jurisdictions because it tends to be common across different countries, right?
Correct,
Yeah,
correct,
yeah.
correct. Yeah, correct.
Okay. What I'd like us to do before we go on with any more questions is I would like us to just take a moment and take a poll of those that we have with us so that we make sure we're speaking to the right people and addressing the right things. And so we're going to put up a poll for all of you. And if you could just let us know what it is, what area you qualify as. We just want to know who's in the room with us. So we will be putting up a poll in a couple in a second. There we go. So please go ahead and just respond to that poll. And we want to know whether you're HR or people and culture professional, whether you're a business owner, founder, whether you're a remote employee or remote contractor, or hybrid, meaning both. You office based and you're also remote. Maybe you're a consultant, coach, advisor, or you're thinking about becoming a remote worker, or any other. And if you're any other, please just type into the chat other and tell us what that looks like. Then this way we know who we are speaking to in the room. So we have a number of HR. professionals. Once we have at least 75%, that will give us a better. You cannot see the poll. It should be on the screen. If it's not on the screen, I wonder if you could go down to the bottom of your page and see if it shows up. It should just show up on your screen. Can everybody else see? Or you cannot also see the poll. Let's see if we get a QR code. Let's see if I say get QR code, what does that do? Okay, I don't know if you can see that. Is the QR code visible? You can share this in your meeting. Oh, okay, sorry, I need to share my screen. One moment and I'll share this QR code with you. Share. Share. Okay. So let me just say this. Okay, if you can see the QR code, go ahead and scan it and it will allow you to poll. Is that working? Maybe I should also try it and see if it works. What's this? I think I need to get rid of that little pin. Okay, see if that works. Yep, it works. So go ahead and try that now. And then we will close it shortly. Yeah, good. I can see a few more of you have been able to respond. Give you another 1 minute, then we can see. This is helpful. So far it looks like the greater percentage we have are HR and people and culture professionals. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen. So we have, okay. There we go. So I think we can end the poll. And this is what we have. You can see the results on your screen now. 64% are HR, people and culture professionals. And then we have 9% as hybrid, then business owner, remote employee or contractor, and exploring remote opportunity, 7%. Consultant, coach advisor, 4%, and other is 2%. So thank you very much for that. This is very helpful as we speak to all of you. We then know who we're speaking to in the room. So I hope that has been helpful. Anne, for you?
Yes,
Yes.
definitely.
Okay. So let's continue the conversation. So working from home can really blur the lines between personal and professional life. Are there any legal standards for things like working hours, reimbursements, or what employers must provide?
Yeah, they are. And in fact, when it comes to rights and obligations, there's really
Mhm,
no difference whether you're on site or whether you're remote, you're working remotely. The minimum terms and conditions of employment prescribed by our labor laws apply to remote workers just as much as they do employees who are working on site. So, like,
mhm,
for example, when we talk about things like maternity leave, you'll be entitled to the same amount of maternity leave. Paternity leave, same thing.
mhm,
Medical cover, if it's provided for employees who are on site, it should be provided for those who are also working remotely. So to that extent, there is no difference. And that is something that should give assurance. If you're working remotely, then you're entitled to the same minimum terms and conditions that are provided for by our labor laws. The only
mhm,
difference is there's a difference in your place of work, but everything else should be the same. Yeah.
mhm. Okay, okay. That's really interesting because I don't think those are things that many people think about. If I'm a remote worker, I'm not expecting that we will discuss these things, but it's helpful to hear you clarify that it's important that
Even hours of work, I dare say, there's this tendency, if you're working remotely, I'm sure many people have experienced that. You tend to perhaps even work more than those people who are working on site simply because, there's no commute time. Uh,
yeah.
and sometimes even lunchtime might just find you at your desk. But it's
Hmm.
the same thing. It's the working hours that apply to those who are working on site should also apply to those who are working remotely. Same with things like even overtime and those sorts of things. So it's
Hmm.
then for the employer to put in place systems to be able to, if somebody is saying they're working overtime and they're entitled to some pay for that, then
Hmm.
it's the employer to put in place systems to be able to monitor that. Yeah.
Wow. So maybe just in line with that question as well is if
Mhm.
a remote worker gets injured while working from home,
Yeah.
who is responsible and how can employers and workers protect themselves?
Okay, so that area of law, I would say, is not very developed in Kenya.
Hmm.
I wouldn't say that I have come across any case where a
Hmm.
remote worker has taken their employer in Kenya to court on account of, having suffered an injury.
Yeah.
Let me just give a random example. So, for example, you're working at your desk and then you get up to get some water.
Hmm.
And perhaps you trip on the cables, your computer cables, and you
Hmm.
hurt yourself,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. However, we look to other jurisdictions at such times when there
Hmm.
is some form of vacuum, so to speak, in our jurisdiction. And you
Hmm.
find like in the US, it's quite developed. So there are a number of court cases and a number of instances where remote workers have taken their employers to court. I think the bottom line is this, that if you look at our Occupational Safety and Health Act, yeah,
Hmm.
and that is the body of law that determines, what are the obligations that an employer should adhere to when it comes to ensuring, safety and health at work,
Yeah.
both the employer but also the employee.
Yeah.
It defines a workplace as a place where the employer's work is going on.
Mm.
Essentially, I have paraphrased, of course. So, for
Yes.
example, if somebody is maybe you're not at a physical premises, maybe you've gone to see a booster somewhere or a
Hmm.
satellite somewhere. I mean, that then becomes a workplace. Or
Hmm.
maybe you've gone outside for a training. That then
Hmm.
becomes, a workplace. So if you're working at home, that's, location, space where you're working,
Yeah.
then it can be interpreted to be a workplace.
Mm.
Um, and again, under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, an employer has various obligations, and one of them includes disseminating information
Hmm.
on health and safety at work. So
Hmm.
it's very important that as the employer, you protect yourself by having a policy. Your health, your safety and health policy should also talk about how can those who are remote workers maintain safety, maintain health,
Hmm.
and go to the extent of having certain minimums. So if you're going to, for example, apply to work, because in most instances, remote work is a benefit. So
Yeah.
you apply for it, as opposed to, so two things. It can be a benefit where you apply for it, or it
Hmm.
can be mandated by the employer, or by the government, like we had during COVID times.
Yes.
If it's a benefit that you're applying for, then the employer should make sure there are certain things that have been put in place before they give you the go ahead to work remotely.
Hmm.
So for example, do you have a proper ergonomic desk? Do you have an ergonomic chair so that you don't one day claim that, my back has been hurting on account of the chair I'm using?
Hmm.
The employer should make sure that, by the time you certify that I have a good desk, I have a good chair, wherever
Hmm.
I'm working is well lit.
Yeah.
And then also provide you with some general guidance, make sure, things like your cables are put out of your way.
Hmm.
Make sure you don't have, like if you have a kettle or some hot water, make sure it's put in a certain way,
Hmm.
providing some general guidance.
Hmm.
Make sure you're standing up to take breaks, make sure
Yeah.
you're hydrating, those sorts of things. So
Mm.
employers should go to the point where your safety and health policy and not only thinks about those people who are on site, but also thinks
Yeah.
about those people who are working remotely. So that in the instance, say that a remote worker is injured, then the
Hmm.
employer can be able to say, hey, we certified that this person had the necessary equipment, and we
Hmm.
went to the extent of, offering some training or some knowledge and information to help them
Hmm.
navigate through what health and safety as a remote worker means.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and if there is an accident, who do you contact? Those sorts of
Hmm.
things. So
Hmm.
it's imperative because many employers have also noticed the benefit of remote working. It's
Hmm.
imperative that you then see that as a workplace, that you then go the extra mile and make sure you have some guidance that you're giving employees to make sure that they are able to work safely
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
such instances. Yeah.
So, what I'm hearing you say, Anne, is that it's not enough to just have a remote working policy. You actually have to go the extra mile and verify, if I heard you use the word certify, that your employee working remotely has met basic minimums and even go as far as providing some basic training on what the expectation is. Did I hear that correctly?
Correct. And that would normally be in the application. So you're signing an application
Hmm.
saying, I would like to apply for remote work. So that
Hmm.
application should also have, some check boxes. I confirm that I have stable internet. I
Hmm.
confirm that I have a desk. I confirm that I have, and some policies I have seen would even require that you take a picture of your
Hmm.
workstation. And
Yeah.
it's only when the employer is satisfied as to the safety that they would then give you the go ahead to work remotely.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so, and in the case where, because I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, in the case where an entrepreneur has engaged a remote worker who's a contractor, does the same apply, or is there, what are the basic minimums?
Yeah, so as a contractor, as a consultant, it's all on you. It's not the
Okay.
employer's risk. It's not the person who's engaging you. Remember,
Yes.
for lack of a better word, they do not concern themselves with even where you're working,
Yes.
how you're working. What they know is there are certain deliverables. You're reporting to us on certain times, and we want
Hmm.
that done before you receive your payment. So it's a completely different ball game.
Hmm.
And maybe I can say that if the remote work has been mandated by the employer, then
Hmm.
it's the employer to make sure that some of these things exist. So, for
Okay.
example, if I am applying to be a remote worker, then it's on me to make sure I have the desk, I have the chair, I have all that.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
remember, a good example was actually during COVID times. If you're
Yeah.
telling people that they need to work remotely, then you
Yes.
need to facilitate that, and that's
Yes.
why people were going to the office to pick their desks and their chairs and,
Yeah.
all that. So it's different treatment for a consultant. It really doesn't. Really, if you're going to work from a restaurant somewhere,
Yeah.
that's on you. So completely different obligations apply for a consultant vis-a-vis an employee.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's good. So Leah's asking a follow-up question here. Can the employer transfer that risk of ensuring health and safety to the employee by having them sign or agree that the employee will bear the risks associated with a remote working benefit And the reason for this is while the employer can check the regular workspace, for example, you can check their home, you may not be able to confirm all possible workstations that the employee can work from. For example, you'll find someone, you've sorted it out for home, but here they are working at Java or at Art Cafe.
Um, Well, first of all, the remote working policy would normally, at least if it's a robust policy, it should require you to indicate where you're working from.
Mm,
Why? And I had a case very recently where somebody was saying they work for a tech company and
hmm.
they were working at a restaurant. I wouldn't name the one they were working for, but
Yeah.
somebody saw them and was able to read what was on the screen, and they were summarily dismissed.
Ooh,
So it's because you see, there's a lot of confidentiality, and that's why those are some of the things the employer wants to make sure. You're not
yes.
working from some restaurant, you're not working
Yeah.
from, just anywhere.
Yeah.
If your remote working application form has been drafted properly, it should actually require that you, as the remote worker, say where exactly are you working from.
Yeah.
And if you're going to change that location, then you need to let us know, um,
Yes.
because there are implications. You need to be in a quiet place. You need
Hmm.
to be able to be available for calls, and virtual meetings.
Yes.
It's a bit hard to do that if you're in a noisy environment, but the most important thing is confidentiality. So you can
Yes.
imagine a third party just being able to see your screen and seeing
Yes.
everything that you're working on. But yes,
Yes.
can you transfer the liability? What you as employer, if somebody has applied, I want to work as a remote worker, you
Hmm.
have your checklist. Do you have stable internet? Do you have a good desk? Do you have a good chair? And of course, it's not just good, it's
Yeah.
ergonomic, the ones that will support
Yes.
your back, support your posture, and those sorts of things. If
Yes.
somebody says they have that, and
Hmm.
really they don't, then it's on them. They can't later on come and say, claim that, I didn't, my back is aching. That as an employer, I certify that you had this sort of a chair that meets the following specifications.
Yeah.
So to that extent, you can, but
Okay.
you then need to make sure you've highlighted to the remote workers what is health and safety when you're working remotely. That is
Hmm.
vitally important, and so that is something that needs to keep being said so that as people are working remotely, they know
Yeah.
that they
Yeah.
actually also have obligations in terms of making sure that they're safe and they're healthy while working.
Mm. Okay. I think because of your example, I want to ask this question. With so much happening online, what's reasonable when it comes to employee monitoring? And how can workers balance trust and privacy?
Wow. Okay. So remote work is the cornerstone of remote work is trust.
Mm,
And that is why you will find that, again, if it's a robust remote working policy, the
hmm.
employer will have reserved their right to terminate a remote working arrangement.
Hmm.
And mostly it will be in instances where there's been a breach of trust.
Hmm.
So maybe it's been noted that, perhaps you're not available for calls when those calls are made, or you're missing deadlines, or your performance has declined,
Hmm.
or you're called and you're clearly are you in a very noisy environment when you are expected to be at your desk. So remote
Yes.
work really is, all about trust.
Hmm.
Um, then the other thing you asked is about monitoring.
Yes.
So now we are talking about a regime where data protection, data privacy is everything.
Hmm.
Um, so that you can't tell somebody, put
Hmm.
a camera, right next to your computer there so that I can be able to, and that is connected to the company's internal system, and we can confirm that for sure you're there. Um,
Yes.
because that's also somebody's home.
Yes.
So you can't go to the extent where you're doing that.
Hmm.
However, if you've drafted again a good data privacy monitoring policy,
Hmm.
then you will have indicated to your staff
Hmm.
that there is monitoring that is happening. And this
Hmm.
monitoring is happening through the systems that we have put in place, whether
Hmm.
it's Slack or Zoom or
Hmm.
Teams
Yeah.
or all that. That monitoring is happening. Again,
Hmm.
monitoring is happening through the communications that are going through the server, the company's server or the company's email, system. And so
Yeah.
there's an expectation that even if you're working remotely or you're working on site, the emails I'm
Mhm.
sending are being whatever are being monitored.
Mhm.
My movements around the company system are being monitored, but it's
Yes.
vitally important that you have communicated it. So it should not be a secret. Um,
Uh-huh.
at the end of the day, yeah, you don't monitor, not in the regime that we are nowadays. You don't, it's the
Hmm.
same thing that if you're in an office, you don't put secret cameras. And that's why
Yeah.
you find those signs that say, this building is under CCTV surveillance.
Yes.
It's important that people need to know that they are being monitored and what
Yeah.
is being monitored and to what extent. You need to have clearly outlined that in a data privacy policy. Some,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
And so, what I hear you saying, and basically, is that we have two things at play here. When we talk about trust, we're actually talking about the culture of the organization.
yeah.
When we talk about surveillance, about privacy, and monitoring. We actually talk about surveillance. And Diana is asking, what steps must employers take to ensure data protection in a remote work environment, considering that while at the office, all the data is controlled in the server. So I don't know if there's some examples you could share that would help with that.
Oh, wow. So for an employer, of course, of vital importance are things like your confidentiality
Hmm.
of the information that you're seeing. And so what's becoming very important based on the experience that I've had is things like your computer and internet use policy.
Hmm.
So what does that say in terms of how you're supposed to use, like, for example, the office equipment or when you're working remotely? And so you will find, and I've seen this both Kenya and in Kenya and in other jurisdictions, if you're
Hmm.
going to be working remotely because you might be working remotely, but even your family members are not supposed to see what you're working on.
Yes.
And so there will be a requirement, for example, that
Mhm.
you make sure you have that, screen protector that
Yes.
prevents people from being able to see what you're working on your screen.
Yes.
There is a requirement to make sure that you're using the company mandated, equipment.
Hmm.
There's a requirement that you're not communicating certain things on certain forums, like I was speaking with someone the other day who works for a tech company, and there are
Hmm.
restrictions on, for example, what you can communicate on WhatsApp.
Hmm.
And so you're always being directed to come back to the company mandated channels. So communicate
Yes.
on Slack or communicate on Teams. Uh,
Yes.
but again, it's a lot of it is based on trust. But the thing is, if you're found to be doing anything that's contrary to that, then the penalty is normally quite serious.
Mm.
So before an employer goes to the extent of saying, yes, you may work remotely,
Hmm.
I think what is clear is there's a lot to be done before then. Is do we have
Hmm.
a clear data privacy policy? Do we have a clear confidentiality policy? Can we
Hmm.
be able to secure so for example, if it's a law firm and you're having court proceedings, there will be
Hmm.
some requirements there in terms of making sure that that process is, not somewhere that anybody and everybody can plug in, you know.
Yes.
And some organizations even go to the extent of being very specific as to who your ISP should be. And they will
Hmm.
say, for example, in that application form, tell us who's your ISP. And if it's an ISP that comes from a country that is not very trusted, they will not authorize you simply because,
Hmm.
that's the system that you're going to be using to communicate with. And
Hmm.
I've seen, again, I go back to tech companies being so specific that, no, we don't know that ISP. The ISPs that we know are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of back-end information that or back-end work that needs to happen for an organization to make sure that they are ready for what
Yes.
remote working means.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
because
No, that's.
again, like for example, just the other day I talked with somebody who was doing online transfers. So for
Hmm.
example, you're an accountant and you
Yes.
need to do your process or upload certain payments so that
Hmm.
somebody, maybe the finance director, comes and does the approval.
Hmm.
If that is being done in a, say, Wi-Fi network that is not secure, what does
Yes.
that mean? And so
Yes.
that's why it's very important, and somebody recently lost a lot of money through that. It's
Mm.
very important that companies have thought through this uh,
Yes.
before they then go ahead and say, you can work remotely because there are
Yes.
definitely inherent risks.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. Okay, let me combine two questions here that I hopefully, you can cover together. So Diane had asked earlier, what legal risks exist if some employees are allowed to work remotely and others are not? And James had asked, to what extent can an employer facilitate remote working? So I don't know if those two questions work together, but if you could respond to those.
Okay, so how do some can work, some cannot work. Again, I go back to the policy. The
Hmm.
policy should also be very objective, in
Hmm.
the sense that making it very clear which are those jobs that can work remotely.
Hmm.
So, but we know there are those positions that you're required to be on site. So there's no question. If, for example,
Yes.
front desk or front office, you have to be on site.
Hmm.
And then you just outline that for everybody else, you need to meet a certain criteria. And so
Hmm.
if everybody meets that criteria, in most cases, you will find, for example, if somebody is on PIP or if somebody is on probation, they might not
Hmm.
be. It depends. I mean, all these are things that should be clearly outlined.
Hmm.
Who can apply? What's the criteria? And if somebody
Hmm.
meets the criteria, allow them to work remotely. The
Hmm.
problem is somebody meets the criteria and then you don't allow them, then there will be issues and questions.
Uh-huh.
But again, think through the possibilities that, and as the employer, reserve certain rights, to suspend remote working in certain instances. So
Hmm.
there are those instances where you find perhaps an employer will say if somebody's performance is slipping, then they will be required to come back on site.
Hmm.
And just make it clear, like, what are the days, what are the times, and those sorts of
Yes.
things. So I think I would go back to policy and making sure your
Yes.
policy is as objective as possible. And
Hmm.
anybody who fulfills the criteria should then
Yeah.
be allowed to work remotely.
Yes.
And of course, if anybody is aggrieved, say by a decision to deny them remote work, then they should be able to go through the company's grievance process for that to be dealt with. So
Mm.
with respect to the second question, do you mind going through it
Sure,
again?
no, I'm happy to. Yeah. So the second question from James was around, to what extent can an employer facilitate remote working?
Yeah, so the employer will normally facilitate remote working, especially in instances where it's in the employer's best interests. So,
Hmm.
like for example, you find in some countries, I was being told, for example, countries like in Belgium, where organizations are taking very little office space, brick and
Hmm.
mortar, very little. So you come
Hmm.
to the office strictly when you need to come to the office, and when you
Hmm.
come to the office, you have perhaps booked in advance that I'll be using this meeting room for this time, this time. If
Hmm.
the employer is the one who is directing people to work remotely, then you have to facilitate. And so those are
Mm.
instances where you'll find the employer will give some form of allowance to enable an employee, settle themselves down for remote working,
Hmm.
secure the requisite equipment, secure the requisite internet and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Get them airtime and all that. So again, depending on your situation and depending
Hmm.
on the financial capability of an organization, then
Hmm.
the employer is at liberty to facilitate to the extent that they are able to. And you
Okay.
find that, many organizations perhaps after COVID then decided, no, come back to work because they were not able to sustain things like, okay, we're going
Yes.
to pay for you for your internet, we're going to pay for your telephone usage. So let's
Yes.
all come back to the office and, save that money. So it's very dependent on, case by case and the organization's capacity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to take us back to a question earlier that had been raised. You talked about the tax compliance.
Mhm.
Nancy was asking if you could speak about a remote worker who is issued a contract by a UK registered company, but the
Mhm.
worker is Kenyan and they're residing in Kenya. So they're engaged as an employee and not a contractor. There's the double taxation agreement between the two jurisdictions, but where ideally would the tax be paid?
Well, first of all, caveat is, tax is not my area of expertise, but just based off of the experience that I have in this regard, KRA will begin to say your income is derived and accrued in Kenya if you've been here for more than 180 days. So
Mm-hmm.
pay us.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why it's important for you, for this person to have sought tax advice. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the most that I can say in that regard. If you're
Okay.
going to be here to the extent that you'll be deemed a tax resident, and
Mm-hmm.
being deemed a tax resident is by virtue of how long you're staying in the country. And so if
Yeah.
someone is coming for a day or two or three, nobody will give you questions. But
Yeah.
when you get to 180 days, I think in our act is actually 183 or something like that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
then KRA will be like, this your income is accrued here. It's
Mm-hmm.
derived in Kenya. And
Mm-hmm.
so in the absence of a double taxation agreement, Kenya will be expecting money. The UK might also be expecting money. If there's a
Mm-hmm.
double taxation agreement, then you will benefit from that.
Okay.
But talking like, for example, a country like Finland that does not have a double taxation agreement with Kenya,
Mm-hmm.
then it
Mm-hmm.
means that Finland is expecting their bit, you're working there, and Kenya is also expecting their bit because, say, for example, you're spending quite a bit of time there. So what I
Mm-hmm.
would definitely say is seek tax advice from
Mm.
the onset. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That's good. That's helpful. That's helpful. Now, yeah, we have a comment from Mary who lives in South Africa and works for a UK-based company, and tax is paid to the South African government. Yeah, so I guess, like Anne says, everybody needs to check within your jurisdiction from a tax consultant exactly what you should be doing. Now, to protect people from sudden termination, what should someone check in their contract and what steps can they take if a dispute arises?
Okay, so thankfully, whether you're working remotely or working on site, the
Hmm.
laws on termination in Kenya apply to both.
Okay.
So, and the laws of termination in Kenya are very geared towards ensuring fairness on both sides. So
Hmm.
that for the employer, you have to make sure you have a valid reason for letting somebody go, which is
Hmm.
related to their performance or their
Hmm.
conduct, or maybe your operational requirements, and you have to follow due process. And of course,
Hmm.
as the employee as well, you have to follow a certain procedure if you want to terminate your contract. So whether you're working remotely or whether you're working on site, the
Hmm.
laws on termination and separation will apply to you. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And so it's
Then
very incumbent on an employer, again, to sit down and think, um, monitoring performance for remote workers,
yeah.
how does that look like?
Yeah.
Because if you're going to terminate somebody on account of poor performance, then there are certain expectations. Uh,
Mm.
make sure you have clear deliverables, make sure you put somebody through a performance improvement plan. That applies whether they're
Mhm.
working in the office or whether
Yeah.
they're working remotely.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And as you ask that, as you answered that and say that, my question also goes to this other side, the flip side, where I've heard of situations where organizations don't honor boundaries, time boundaries for their staff, and are not then and are therefore expecting responses after working hours. Could you speak to that? Because I think we even heard in some countries where, if you're caught doing that, then you're in trouble.
Oh yeah, but I mean, in Kenya they tried that, and the law didn't go anywhere in terms of I think it was I forget the name of the law, but don't contact me beyond a certain time.
Hmm.
So I think it very much depends. If an employer is going to the extent of first of all, if you're in certain calibers and certain professions, then there's
Hmm.
already an expectation. Say you're in a managerial position.
Hmm.
Your
Hmm.
managerial position, you can't make noise if you're being called at 10 o'clock because there's an emergency on the factory
Yes.
floor.
Hmm.
So it really just depends on the, circumstances of the case. But I think at the
Hmm.
back of the mind, every employer should know, at what point does this then become harassment?
Mm.
When this is something that becomes, constant and it's unnecessary, and really
Hmm.
you can communicate either before or after, or the next day. So I
Yes.
think we are getting to that point again. Our jurisdiction, we've not had a case that we can reference, but we're
Hmm.
getting to that point where every employer has to sit down and think, at what point does this then become mental, some form of psychological harassment.
Yes.
To that, there is a form of harassment that's called, that psychological harassment is where
Yes.
you're constantly just taunting somebody, and
Yes.
in this day and age, you'll find you've gotten a message on WhatsApp. There's
Yes.
the person, and actually someone was giving me this example very recently, is that they
Hmm.
receive an email, and then before they've even read the email, there's a Slack, whatever
Yeah.
to that effect. Before you've even interacted with that, there's a WhatsApp.
Mm.
Again, we need to really begin to start thinking through such,
Yes.
ways of working that
Yes.
ultimately somebody can argue that I'm being
Yes.
harassed psychologically. Yeah.
Yes. No, that's good. That's really good. Let me ask this other question before I go to some of the questions in the chat. So many people are embracing work from anywhere lifestyles.
Yeah.
Could this create legal or immigration risks for either the worker or the employer?
Definitely it will. So, for example, uh, and that's why you'll find like a robust employment, remote working policy should ask you where exactly are you working from,
Hmm.
because the employer will be concerned if
Hmm.
I'm employed in Kenya, I'm supposed to be working from my home in Kenya, and then all of a sudden I am in the Bahamas.
Hmm.
It might not even be the Bahamas, maybe I'm just next door in Uganda or in
Hmm.
Tanzania, you know?
Hmm.
But there are obligations. If you're working in Tanzania, are you working on the correct immigration document, Because you don't just walk into a jurisdiction and start working. You need
Mm.
to make sure you have the right immigration document that permits you to work.
Hmm.
And the employer will also be concerned about certain things. We've certified your workplace in Nairobi. We don't know
Hmm.
about this other workplace. Um,
Yes.
and so definitely for many employers, you will find they're very keen on that, and you have to report that, okay, now I have changed, I've actually moved homes, I am now staying here, I'm no longer staying in Nairobi, I'm now staying in Nyeri,
Hmm.
or we will be moving to Uganda. Those sorts of things you have to communicate because those risks arise. And remember, like
Yes.
for example, immigration, it's
Hmm.
on the employer to make sure that they're securing the right immigration document for you. Obviously, it's
Hmm.
also an offense for you to be working on a wrong immigration document, but
Yes.
the employer has that obligation. It's an offense for you to employ somebody who's not working on the correct immigration document.
Yes.
And so, yes, the like nomad visas and all that, so exciting. We
Yes.
would all like to embrace them. I think consultants,
Hmm.
contractors,
Yes.
entrepreneurs and founders and people who are working autonomously can certainly benefit from that. If
Hmm.
you're an employee working remotely, there are considerations, especially
Mm.
from tax perspective, from the labor laws that apply, and also from an immigration perspective. Those could be bottlenecks, and so it's very important that you notify your
Yes.
employer before you take those up.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. Now, we have a question here. If all employees work fully remotely, should the company pay for WIBA?
Well, WIBA is mandatory in the sense that there is an obligation on the employer to obtain insurance for work-related injuries and
Hmm.
sicknesses and
Hmm.
those sorts of things.
Hmm.
And so even if everybody is working remotely, I
Hmm.
don't think you can run away from that obligation.
Hmm.
The obligation protects employees in the event that there is an accident. And it protects the employer to the extent that if there is an accident that is deemed occupational, the
Hmm.
money for compensation does not come from the employer, it comes from the insurance company.
Hmm.
And so unless and until there is um, remember, most of these laws were passed when remote working was not even a factor.
Yes.
This WIBA, for example, these laws came into force. They were drafted 2007, came into force 2008.
Hmm.
We were not really talking about remote working at that point, but I
Yes.
would hesitate as an employer to not secure a WIBA cover simply on
Mm.
account of the fact that everybody's working remotely.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That's helpful. Another question, what legal implications would arise if you work in an organization that exists in two or more jurisdictions? So in this situation, remote work is a provision for US-based staff, but there's no provision for Kenyan-based staff.
Hmm. Well, what is the question?
What legal implication would arise if you work in an organization that exists in two or more jurisdictions? So in this case, there's the US and there's Kenya. And
Okay.
so there's a remote work provision for the US based staff, but there's no provision for Kenyan based staff. I think this
Ah,
is back to that earlier question about, um, can some work remotely and others not work remotely? So in the US, you've told everyone they can be remote, but here, there's no provision.
okay. I think I would always go back to in this day and age, there's a lot of complaints about discriminatory treatment.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be a justification as to why one treatment is being applied in one place and it's not being applied in the other place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's why
Mm-hmm.
for me, the word and the key is always objective.
Okay.
Um, at some point, it was more we have to understand that the reality is that remote working is not something that is new
Yeah.
in the Western concept.
Yeah.
And so I can understand why an organization could historically have
Yeah.
authorized, if you're American or if you're working in the US, you're working remotely. But in Kenya, because it was perhaps not something that had been embraced, it was
Mm-hmm.
new, everybody is working.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's working on site. I can
Yeah.
see that because that's something that's a very old practice on one end and
Yes.
relatively new on this other end. But at
Yes.
the end of the day, you have to then begin to ask yourselves then, is there a reason or a justification for the difference?
Yes.
Uh, should it not be harmonized? Uh,
Yeah.
just to avoid, issues to do with, possible discriminatory treatment and
Okay.
all that. Yeah.
That's good. Now we have 3 minutes to go, and I have three different questions. But let me pick this question if, in case we don't get to the other two. How best should an HR professional based in Kenya get guidance on Employment Act or law for different African countries where the company is working? For example, Ghana, Zambia, Uganda, and I think this is the same.
Yeah.
If someone is here and they're maybe from Ghana and want to know how they can access the different laws, how best can they do that?
Unfortunately, it cannot be easier than contacting a labor lawyer in that jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, yes, to a large extent, there's a lot that information that you can get online, but can you
Mm-hmm.
trust it? So the
Mm-hmm.
best thing, and that's why you find like multinationals that are operating in different jurisdictions, you find they have lawyers in all those jurisdictions. That's
Okay.
really the best way to protect yourself.
Okay, okay, good. Thank you for that. And now a very short and succinct answer to these two. Are employers required to reimburse remote employees for home office expenses or equipment? And the second question, how do labor unions and collective bargaining agreements apply to remote work arrangements? Those are our final questions.
Well, it's very rare. I mean, I'm yet to find a CBA that deals with remote working for the simple reason that CBAs normally cover they don't normally cover employees who are working remotely because most of the
Mm,
employees that they are covering are employees who are either on the shop floor or in the factory
yes.
floor or in the field somewhere. And so
Hmm.
you won't normally find that a CBA will deal with that. So
Yes.
that's a short answer to that. The other question will be, an obligation on an employer to provide certain things. I think we've touched on that. If
Yes.
it's the employee who's applying for it, then strictly speaking, then if you want that benefit, you need to satisfy your employer that you're able to
Yeah.
have the requisite equipment. Your employer, of course, can come in and say, oh, don't worry about internet, we'll pay for that. And you do
Yes.
find, I know some multinationals who will actually give you like an internet allowance or a furniture allowance and those sorts of things. But again,
Yes.
very much company specific. But if I,
Yes.
as your employer, am mandating you to work remotely, then I do
Yes.
have an obligation to facilitate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for a brilliant conversation. And we want to drop into the chat how people can get in touch with you if they need to engage you and your services. And we will also be dropping into the chat how anyone can get to know a little bit more about what I do. But thank you for those hands, and we can have some more hands saying thank you to Anne for great insight today. So thank you very much for joining us. We have in the chat the link to um, Anne. The link to Anne's LinkedIn is coming up. Just give it a minute. Please don't leave until you have it so that you have it with you. for Anne Babu, and you can reach out to her. But I think you will all agree with me that this has been a really good conversation. And I do hope that it helps you work out what works for you, whether you're a contractor, a professional. There we go. The link is in there for Anne. Whether you're a lawyer, whether you're thinking through further opportunities in remote work. And we would also love to hear from you. What other conversations would be helpful for you? So thank you again for joining us. And Anne, thank you once again. Yes.
Thank you
Okay.
for
And
having
have a
me
good
and
evening to
have a good
everybody.
evening.
Okay. Bye bye.